Hello there, and welcome to week 3 of the course. How I'd like to start most of these weekly videos is just doing a brief outline of what we did the week before, and then kind of show how that's going to lead into the work that we do this week. So just recall that last week we started in Module 1, and Module 1 is primarily focused on what we call human inference. In other words, given a set of information, what do we infer from that information? We started the first part of the week by looking at different news articles, ways that information that was presented, and we saw the effect that that information had on our inference. And you saw that sometimes that because of the way information is initially presented, that the inference is incorrect, or there's something wrong in the information itself that causes incorrect inference. The second part of the week's work, what you did was look at some basic statistical summaries, and hopefully those were primarily a review. I knew it had probably been a while since you had seen them, but hopefully you feel more comfortable with them now. In particular, making histograms, whether you drew them by hand or made them in Excel, either one is fine, but it is important that you understand how to make those, because in Module 2, we're going to be making more histograms, and having that tool set is going to be very important. So like I said, in Module 1, we're primarily focused on this idea of inference. And so starting this week's material, what we're going to do is we're going to look at experimentation. And we're going to look at what needs to happen in an experiment in order to have good inference. In other words, what needs to take place in an experiment so that the inference we make from that experiment is valid. And what you're going to find is there are things that can go wrong with an experiment. And in particular, if certain things aren't performed, we have what's called a confounding variable. In other words, it's a variable that is going to interfere with the inference that we make. And sometimes we can identify what those confounding variables are, and sometimes we can't. And so that's why it's really important to properly set up experiments. Now, with that being said, I did want to talk a little bit about good ways to study for the course. So starting this week, you are going to start to see a lot of new vocabulary, and it is very important to keep up with the vocabulary as we move along in the course. And the reason for that is this is a conceptual statistics course. So in other words, the concepts for this course are incredibly important, and they are the bulk of the material. Now, that's not to say we aren't going to do any computations, but the concepts are really the meat of the course, and the computations come second. And so understanding the vocabulary really leads to an understanding of the concepts and the ideas in the course. I don't know how many times I've taught students and they'll put all of their focus on those computations, and they'll think, oh, doing the math has got to be the most important part because this is the statistics course. Well, that's really just not the case. The ideas in this course, the concepts, those are the most important part. You do need to be able to do the computations, but the ideas are the really big part. So the question is, what's the best way to study the vocabulary words and really start to understand these ideas? So with the vocabulary words, I think one of the best ways is a way that many of you probably already use, which is to use index cards. Now, I would not make these index cards right before the exam. And instead, what I would do is every time that you're presented with a new vocabulary word, I would make yourself a new index card and keep it in your pile to study. The other thing you can do, and this is actually what I like to do, is to take just a regular sheet of paper and I fold it in half. And what I'll do is on one side here, I will write down the vocabulary word. On the other side, I'll write down the definition. That way I can kind of flip back and forth when I study. And I like that better than index cards just because they're all in 1 or 2 pages and it's easier for me to keep together. But either way, the point is you want to keep up with the vocabulary words as we go along in the course and not try to memorize them all at the very end. And also remember, on page 273 of the workbook, there is a glossary with all of these terms on it. And you really do want to use these definitions and not ones that you find online. And that's because these definitions will match up with what's in the videos and what we're looking at in the workbooks. Now, with that being said, one thing that I have tried to do in the videos that I make and the handouts that I present is there are going to be some vocabulary words that have more than one name to them. And so the workbook may not necessarily present both names to you, but I want to make sure that you have both names so that way when you encounter these ideas in the future, you'll be like, oh yeah, I've heard of that before. It goes by one of these names. And so for an example, if you'll recall all the way back to high school science, when you first learned about experiments, you probably heard about what's called the independent and the dependent variable. Well, we're going to have a review of those today, except instead of calling them the independent and the dependent variable, you're going to find the workbook calls them the explanatory and the response variable. It's just different names for the exact same thing. And you may say, well, why aren't we using independent and dependent? And honestly, the reason for that is out there in the real world, if we're looking, so recall independent and explanatory are going to mean the same thing. Those two names are used interchangeably for the exact same concept, and they're used equally. It's not like one's more popular than the other one. So that's why it's important, I feel, that you be introduced to both of those names for the terms. And so you're going to see that today in the work. I've tried to introduce you to both the idea that explanatory variable and independent variable are the same thing, and dependent and response variable are the same thing. And so what I would do is when you're making those note cards, so for example, when you make your note card for explanatory variable, in parentheses underneath them, I might just put independent variable as a reminder, hey, if I see this thing in the future, it might go by this other name. And so when you learn about a confounding variable today, it also goes by the name lurking variable. And like I said in the notes, I've tried to make that clear, but that's just so in the future when you see these, it doesn't matter which name they use, you're comfortable with that idea. So, with that being said, if you have any questions about the work, please feel free to ask. Use that discussion board. I think it's a really good tool. It lets you see, other people have maybe the same question that you have. You're not alone in this course by any means. One thing that I do want to kind of keep the discussion board as organized as possible. So if you have a brand new question, use that reply up at the top and just reply to my post, and that'll group kind of your question together when I answer it. And then of course, if you have a reply to somebody else's question, then reply to it. And the other thing I'm going to try to do this week is this will really be the first week that you have true graded material. So after I get the grading done, I'm going to post a video on the announcements. And in that video, I'm going to show you how to access the gradebook in Canvas. I'm going to show you how to actually access your individual assignments and see the comments that I have made on them. So that way you'll know exactly where your grade comes from and you'll be able to see exactly what you missed. This is really important because when it comes time to the exam, you won't see the exact same problems that you saw on on the weekly work, but you will see similar problems. And so that way, if you understand what you missed on the weekly work, where the individual weekly work assignments really aren't worth that much individually of your grade, you won't miss that same problem on the exam, which is a bigger chunk of your grade. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I'll be around all week, and have a great week.